Always the most exciting part of any live stream or video is the first 30 seconds where you're just sitting there waiting for people to show up, waiting for things to get rolling, sort of warming up the crowd. Riveting stuff, I know. But I thought I'd give you some updates here. So usually before I start the actual recorded part uh, of the podcast, I usually do some quick news and updates, and those usually include things that I've tweaked about the podcast. We're only 4 episodes in, and already I've done some major tweaks to sort of my introduction. If you've listened to previous episodes, you'll know that in the SoundCloud uploads, I've added a theme song and an outro. I mean, it's the same thing. I am also tweaking some of the intro text so that it's less focused on it's my library, but it's really about the books and how interesting those books are, and not necessarily about them being in my library that makes them special. It's the books themselves that are special, not necessarily the library that they're in. Other things to update are I have a Telegram channel for the podcast now, and other things. Basically, everything that's with the handle Anthropology Archives, it's all going to be announced through the Telegram channel. So if you want updates on when you want to know what next week's episode is going to be, or if you want to see what the lithic illustration final illustration looks like, because maybe you don't really want to tune in to the live stream on Thursday afternoons, but you want to see what the lithic illustrations look like. I usually post a picture of the lithic illustrations for people to see, although I may change that because I'm probably going to start offering those on a Patreon page for people to have copies, or not copies, the actual illustrations themselves. So I'm working on a Patreon page. I need to get more content out there before I actually feel like it's ready to launch with stuff. You kind of have to have content for people to want to become patrons. So that's what we're working on here. I mean, we've only got 4 episodes of the podcast. We've only got 4 lithic illustrations that I can hold my name to. But we're generating more content each and every week. There's a possibility there may be a collaboration in the near future on a introduction to anthropology course. So there might be a podcast series where we talk about basic concepts in anthropology, because there really doesn't seem to be a podcast out there that talks about basic anthropological concepts. So things like the history of anthropology, or Franz Boas, or processualism, postmodernism, talking about globalization, all these sorts of things that I think would be really helpful for an educational podcast that just don't exist right now. So that's potentially in the works. We'll see how that looks in a month's time from now, when I hear back from all the other people, the balls that are in the air for that possible podcast, if it may or may not happen. But those are the major updates that I can think of. I guess other major updates. Currently working on a grant proposal that I have to get in by March 31st, so I'm kind of stressing about that. It's a very small grant. It's like $680, but it's still a grant that I have to work on nonetheless. I got the proposal in for this summer's field school, which I'm hoping I'll be able to do some live streaming and possibly make some videos about the 2021 summer field school at Cuyahoga Community College. We'll see how that plays out. I've had to make it COVID appropriate, so you had to follow COVID policies. Who knows what COVID will look like in the summer of 2021, but I still had to put in the application for the research permit so then I can go out and do the excavation anyway. So that hopefully will be in the works. I'm excited about that. The site has not been excavated before, so, excavated extensively. I should say it has been excavated, but it's been really reconnaissance surveyed. So that'll be this summer. So if you're in one of my classes and you're one of my students tuning into this, and you're not watching this, so far into the future that you can't possibly sign up for it, Summer 2021, we're probably going to be doing a field school and excavating a site very close to the Tri-C Western campus. So that's exciting. Hopefully things go through. Like I said, I just submitted the application yesterday. We'll see what Cleveland Metro Park says on whether or not they want to give me the green light to excavate on their property. Although I don't think we'll have any issues with that, but you never know. Sometimes there's political things at play where people's egos and personalities get in the way with applications of that matter. But I should probably get rolling on this week's episode. So just to reiterate, this is usually the warm-up segment, 5 to 10 minutes where I kind of give updates, news about what's going on with Anthropology Archives, the sort of, I guess you could say it's a channel, but it's sort of a brand that I've put together just so it's sort of all cohesive. Since I've made educational games for classes, I've made podcast episodes like this, and a lot of live streaming content that I can sort of consolidate into one central location. But then we transition into the actual quote recorded part. It's not actually going to be, I don't click record or anything. It's just how I divide it. Editing, Eric divides this up after the fact for the podcast episode. So really the podcast hasn't begun, and it'll begin here in just a moment. And I have my script in front of me. So as usual, at least for the people who are tuning in for the live stream, you'll see my head turning towards a script. It's because I'm reading a script for certain segments. Some of it's off the cuff, which reminds me, before we get started, I need to pull up the reviews that I had, but I had to switch accounts because I can't use my live streaming OBS Studios on my other login. So I have to do it on this academic login. Goodreads. So bear with me while I pull up the Amazon review that I had picked out. Because this is surprisingly one of the few ones in the 4 episodes that I've done so far. This is the first one that we have actual Amazon and Goodreads reviews. So we actually have reviews that we can talk about. Oh, come on. Let's load Amazon. There we go. Maybe someday. Scroll down. Yeah, okay. All right, we have those pulled up. So we're going to get rolling with the recorded segment. And obviously, if you're watching from the live stream or you're watching on the YouTube channel, it's going to look a little different than the sort of polished product, because I go back in after the fact and I edit the audio, and then I add in the intro music, I add in maybe a little hook, and then I also kind of tweak the I guess audio, not that much, but it looks a little different when you listen to it on SoundCloud than if you were to listen to it on the live stream or on the YouTube channel. But with that said, let's get rolling with this week's episode. Hello, and welcome to From the Archives, a short podcast where I talk about a book from my library and whether you should or shouldn't read it. I'm Eric, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. This podcast is recorded live on Twitch at Anthropology Archives every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. That's Anthropology Archives, all one word, lowercase. During live recordings, I promise to read all questions and comments from the chat in a different accent or voice to make it seem like someone else is talking. Don't worry, if you've missed the live stream, you can listen to old episodes on my SoundCloud at Anthropology Archives, and you can also watch old episodes on my YouTube channel of the same name. Every episode, I ask myself the following questions. Who wrote this book? What's it about? What are other people saying? Should you read it? And whether I should can it or keep it. And can it or keep it on the bookshelf, that is. With that being said, let's pull a book from the shelf. And this week's, I didn't really have to go that far. It was basically directly behind me on the bookshelf. And that's because I have a whole section on my bookshelf that's just like right next to my desktop that I can quickly pull, because these are books that I consider frequently referenced, frequently pulled to look through. And so this week we're actually talking about one that is in that section of archaeology and anthropology. And that book is Indian Women and French Men, Rethinking Cultural Encounter in the Western Great Lakes by Susan Sleeper Smith. That's, as you can probably guess from the title, this is a academic or very, scholarly style book. This is not exactly a novel or some sort of light read, which is pretty common of the books on the bookshelf. But you may have noticed, before I really get into the book, you may have noticed, if you've listened to the other 3 podcasts or the other episodes so far, that I've tweaked a little bit of the intro. I've been thinking more and more with each episode that the actual stories of how I got these books isn't all that exciting, except for maybe a handful of them. So, like, there's a section of my bookshelf that's for rare and old books that have kind of an interesting history about, like, some of them I bought in Europe, and a few other ones have interesting histories of, like, I found them like on the street. But those are few and far between, and when we get to those ones, they will have a story of their own of how I got them. But this is not one of those books. This is actually a book I bought on Amazon for a class in graduate school, so not a very exciting history there. So who wrote it? Let's talk about Susan Sleeper Smith, which, by the way, is a pretty cool name. It sounds sort of like a Tom Clancy kind of name, or a Tom Clancy character if you were not great at... Actually, you know what? It's probably more like a... why am I blanking on it? Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid kind of name. Sleeper Smith sounds sort of like a don't mess with Sue Sleeper Smith. She's a Green Beret kind of thing. But actually, Susan Sleeper Smith is a history professor at Michigan State University, and she's also on the faculty of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Michigan State. And as of 2018, she is also the interim director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. But that's pretty much all I could find about Susan Sleeper Smith. There really wasn't a whole lot of information that I could scrounge up for this episode talking about her. But if I had to guess, she's a history professor from Michigan State. That means she's probably got her PhD in history, probably sometime in the 70s or 80s would be my guess, based on the one profile photo that I saw on Michigan State. So that's pretty much all I've got on Susan Sleeper Smith. And she is white, which is something that will come up when we talk about the book reviews. Is at least one person was a little salty because this book about Indian women and French men, unsurprisingly, talks about women and female perspectives, and this one person, who I'm presuming is probably a white male, but I could be wrong, took issue with the fact that we had a white female historian writing about indigenous history. But we'll get into that with the book reviews. So what is this book about is something that we'll have to address first. And really, I guess I should show the cover for people who are watching. Essentially, the cover is not that exciting. It's just a red background, and then it's an oval portrait of one of the women talked about in the book. There's a middle section of the book that has color prints of portraits by George Winter. You may recognize the name George Winter. He's a very well-known American portraitist, I guess is how you would say that. And a contemporary of his would have been, I believe, another George Catlin, who also did a lot of paintings of American Indians in the early 19th century. But the one on the cover is actually, oh boy, I'm going to butcher this name. It's Demush Kiki Ao by George Winter. And it is a gift of Mrs. Cable G. Ball. So, as in one of the relatives of the Ball brothers who founded Ball State in Muncie, Indiana, which is where I went to grad school. So unsurprising that I would end up reading a book that has heavy ties to Ball State and history with Ball State. But yeah, the cover is just a portrait of a woman. And what's interesting about it, and something that I'll kind of talk about with a few passages from the book, is that this woman on the cover she's wearing this really nice shawl, and I know I'm recording this on a potato. At least the image is basically on a potato, so it's a really grainy image. But you can tell from the portrait that this woman has some really nice earrings. She has really nice combed hair. It's put into a bun or something. It's behind her head. And she's also got this shawl, this really bright blue and red shawl and dress that's draped around her. And then she's got these discs, these metal discs that are most likely made out of silver. And then she has a bunch of beads around her and a necklace. And what really is being called out with this is that this is not how, at least Americans in the 1830s, when this woman was being painted, this is not how Americans viewed indigenous culture. And that's something that we're going to get into. And one of the things that Susan Sleeper Smith's book does is it kinds of questions this perspective of the removal era and the removal policies of 1820s and 30s, like the Jackson administration. You probably already knew that Andrew Jackson was a dirtbag before I started talking about this podcast. But if you end up reading this book, and by the end of this podcast, you'll really think he's a dirtbag, just because of the era that he was in. And there's a few passages that I think really succinctly encapsulate what this book is about. And I'm actually going to pull a couple of them because I had, luckily, before I started this episode, I don't read these books cover to cover in most cases right before the episode. So I actually read this like 4 or 5 years ago, but I was rereading parts of it because I have all sorts of dog ears in here. And I've got my own notes in the margins. Like this one right here is talking about agriculture is considered progress to like the American ethos. So if you weren't a farmer, somehow you were backwards or less civilized, or as she says, quote, savage, if you weren't, a practicing farmer. But that's not the passage I wanted to call out. The passage I wanted to call out, it's literally just a sentence, but I feel like this sentence pretty much sums up a lot of what Sleeper Smith is talking about in this book. And it's just one sentence. There was little to entice Easterners west if the frontier was already occupied. And what she means by this is really removal policies that happened in the Midwest. And for our purposes, I would call the Midwest Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I'm sure we could debate Minnesota, Iowa. Why am I blanking on other states that would be possibly considered? Kentucky, maybe? I don't know. I wouldn't really consider Kentucky the Midwest. But we're not probably going to have many debates about those original states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We can probably all agree that that's Midwest. We can add more, but I don't think we can subtract those from the definition of Midwest. But our understanding probably collectively for those of us that were raised and educated in the Midwest, went from K through 12 education, that is, we're probably taught in the 4th grade about indigenous history, mostly in terms of Tecumseh. And then we might have learned about the Trail of Tears in the South. But we didn't necessarily learn a whole lot about indigenous removal policies and resistance to those policies in the Midwest as much as we probably learned more about the Trail of Tears. Like, we probably all remember that because it's not much of the history that sticks out to us. And part of that is because of the horrible education system where we teach this stuff in the 4th grade. When I was a substitute a few years back, I actually substituted for a 4th grade class in Bath, Ohio, where they were learning about Tecumseh via a comic book. And they had Tecumseh dressed in like a loincloth and had feathers in his hair. And he was never wearing a shirt. And I think that really gets to the point or the issue with how we teach American Indian history in the Midwest, and how it's very much this perspective of, well, once Tecumseh died, that was it. There were no Native Americans or indigenous people in the Midwest after Tecumseh died. Like, everyone was just like, well, we lost. Let's just hightail it out of there. And actually, there's a quote in here that Susan Sleeper Smith has. Oh, shoot, I had it pulled up. A quote in here by another historian, Richard White. And this is what Richard White had to say about Tecumseh. The imperial conquest over the Pays d'Enhaut, which is French, it's spelled phonetically as Pays d'Enhaut, but it's pronounced Pays d'Enhaut, ended with the War of 1812, and politically the consequence of Indians faded. They could no longer pose a major threat
or be a major asset to an empire or a republic, and even their economic consequence declined with the fur trade. Tecumseh's death was a merciful one. He would not live to see the years of exile and the legacy of defeat and domination. And what Sleeper Smith is arguing is basically this narrative is not the whole story. There was a lot of resistance, and in fact, people like the woman on the cover, and I would argue she's not even the most important person from this book. It's really another lady whose portrait is in the middle of the book, and I'm holding up for the live stream viewers, and that's Frances Slocum, who's basically the godmother. It's stories of these women who utilized French fur traders as basically alliance builders, using marriage as an alliance, but also fictive kin networks. And it's story after story of people like Frances Slocum who married a French fur trader and became the godmother of northeastern Indiana, the Fort Wayne area, down into Muncie, because there are all sorts of historic accounts that Sleeper Smith talks about where you had people who tried to trade or tried to sell things in, say, the Fort Wayne area, and they just couldn't drum up any business because they weren't a relative. And basically, if you weren't a godparent or an aunt or an uncle or a nephew or a brother or a sister or a grandparent, you just did not have the economic connections. And so these economic systems were mostly based on fictive kin and, affinal ties, so marriage ties. And that's how they resisted these sort of removalist policies. And so, to backtrack here, Frances Slocum being, I would argue, the godmother of Indiana, she ran a quarter of the state in terms of economic control by being the godmother of so many people, and everyone was vying to be her godmother. And so there's a lot of discussion about how Catholicism and the use of fictive kin created these economic incentives so that if you were a white European settler trying to move into, say, northeastern Indiana to stake a claim in what is, prized economic land, you had to intermarry or become a godparent to someone in order to actually make a successful living in this territory. And so this painting of Frances Slocum was revised originally, and I actually have my notes here. There's another picture of her with her sisters, and she looks a little bit tougher, and she has fewer wrinkles, and she's sitting on a pedestal, and she still looks old for sure. But George Winter was asked to revise the portrait to give her more wrinkles and make her look more frail and weak, because people didn't like the idea of having this strong, powerful woman running like the economics of a territory. And so she looks very similar to the lady on the front cover, except she's older. She's got much more modest earrings. They're much smaller. I mean, they're probably the size of like a pinky. She's also wearing a black and red shawl, and then she doesn't really have any other adornments, parting her hair down the middle and presumably in a bun or something in the back. So, this is a pretty common portrait style of other women depicted in the book. But really, I think those two passages summarize a lot about what this book talks about. And one of the reasons it's emphasizing George Winter's portraits, George Winter, the portraitist, is because he was very much trying to document Native Americans as they were and what they actually looked like. But there was a lot of pushback within Congress because this doesn't fit the nice narrative of, well, as I said in that earlier sentence, people don't want to move out west if the West is already occupied, and it's already occupied by people who are economically more successful than them. If you can imagine squatters coming into Indiana who are trying to make a life for themselves, and they get there, and, Godmother Frances Slocum says, hey, look, I don't know you. You're not any kin of mine, so I'm not going to do business with you. Get lost. And you have people like George Winter trying to document people in the dress that they have when these, what's the word I'm looking for? Intricate and ornate. Those are the words I'm looking for. Intricate and ornate regalia and dress, and it doesn't fit this perspective. And actually, Susan Sleeper Smith has a quote, and I know I've been very quote heavy with this book review so far, and I probably, oh gosh, we're already running pretty close to end of time for this episode, because I still want to get to the reviews. But I'll read one more passage about this, and then we'll move on to what other people are saying about it. This is a selected quote from George Winter. I honestly claim originality with many Indian subjects, and familiarity with Indian life which few in the profession have. Many painters have painted Indians from the imagination. I know, until I saw the Red Man, how sorely I was misled. So George Winter was on this sort of campaign to paint people in the Midwest as they looked, and people didn't like that. And case in point, that 4th grade class that I was in, where it was a comic of Tecumseh wearing a loincloth and he was basically butt naked. And that doesn't mesh well with the cover of this book, where you have a woman who very clearly looks wealthy and has really nice clothes and really intricate, ornate jewelry. That's not the picture that people want to see of indigenous people succeeding, doing well, having large agricultural tracts of land, helping out war efforts in the South when the Cherokee and other tribes started, fighting Americans. People like Frances Slocum, I don't think they actually mentioned her in particular, but other, strong female leaders were able to send agricultural surplus down to feed the troops. And that narrative doesn't look great when you have people like Andrew Jackson saying, well, what about the poor people in Kentucky who are squatting and they want that land? Well, they can't economically compete. So if you can't economically compete, kick the people out or kill them, which is what we saw with the Jacksonian removal policy and the Trail of Tears and forced removal to Western reservation systems, which is not an exactly cheery way to end on talking about what the book is about, but we do need to transition to talking about what other people are saying. And what's exciting about this is the first book I think we've had so far, and I know we've only done 4, but the first book where we have Amazon reviews and Goodreads reviews, and not just star ratings. So on Amazon, it's got an average rating of 4.7 out of 5. And granted, there's only 15 reviews on Amazon. And on Goodreads, it has a 3.67 out of 5, and that's over 42 ratings. So I just want to... some of these Amazon reviews are kind of interesting. At least 2 of them are basically just like one-word reviews. Like Rose Pettibon gave it 5 stars on May 9th, 2019. And her review is as follows. Always. That's it. There's nothing more to it. Or J.P. O'Malley gave it 5 stars on December 1st, 2016. And O'Malley says, super duper. And then here's the one that I wanted to call out and mention from earlier, and how definitely younger me, who was maybe a little more angsty, a little less, I guess you could say, woke. I wrote in here, there was one thing I wrote in here. Seriously, is this book about women or about how men exploited them? Seriously. That's a note that I wrote. I can't believe I wrote that. But I guess that was in response to, there's a lot of segments in this book where there's digressions. And I do remember this intently, being frustrated with wanting to read the historical aspects, and then there was sort of an interpretivist perspective that Sleeper Smith would insert that didn't feel like it was as well reasoned. Not necessarily saying that it was needed to be thrown out, but it definitely felt like it was a shift in tone and pace every once in a while at the end of a chapter. After like going through this heavy slog of dry detail, you'd get to sort of a synthesis that felt less polished than the rest of the book. And this book reviewer, it just says Kindle customer, so I don't know anything else about this person, but you can probably guess what kind of person wrote this review. They gave it a 3 out of 5, so they had things to say about it, but they still gave it a 3 out of 5, and this was written December 6, 2013. The author is too interested in rewriting history to meet a feminist agenda. Instead of sticking to what is known and proven to have happened, she inserts herself and her own opinion and fantasies of what she thinks, quote, wishes had happened. Which is sad because colonial Indian women who married into the French fur trading society were by and large interesting and independent in their own right, without having Anglo-feminist professors invent stuff about them. The problem I have with this quote is that Susan Sleeper Smith does talk about, Indian women. She does talk about French fur traders. She spends like half the book giving you this really dry history of the French fur trade in the Midwest.
and talking about extensive historical details. To quote another person's review here on Amazon, Jeffrey Mingo, who also gave it a 3 out of 5 back in 2005. This is not a cute recounting of Sacagawea and her French husband. This is not Pocahontas and John Smith with the Parisian accent. You can tell that the author is a historian's historian. She is writing for an audience of scholars on Native Americans. She looks at 4 examples taking place in the Midwest during the 1700s and 1800s to talk of how intermarriage and miscegenation played a role in European exploration, domination, and trade. You have to be well versed in Native American studies and Midwestern history in order to understand this text. I hope the author gets tenure because this was truly an erudite text. Unsophisticated readers, be warned. So I think that just juxtaposes these two kind of perspectives. I think the Kindle customer might have thought this was going to be less of an academic read, whereas Jeffrey Mingo here probably kind of knew going into it is going to be more of an academic read. Certainly this is going to be a historian's kind of book. It's definitely got that juicy detail, dense, thick description of histories that for a lot of people can be dry and not as exciting. But if that interests you, then I definitely recommend this book. I think it's sort of pivotal and critical that if you want to actually understand how removal policy came about and understanding why, American racism towards indigenous people in the Midwest is so prevalent, this book gives you a lot of good context for that. And I think it's invaluable when having discussions about the Midwest and its history of settlement. But that being said, it is a little bit more academic than your average history book. It's not some World War II book that you can find in any bookstore and pick up off the shelf and it's like a quick page turner. This is definitely not that, for sure. And a lot of 5-star reviews. I'm surprised. On Goodreads, there's only 3 reviews. I'm not going to read all of them. We've got Matthew Russell here, gave it 5 out of 5. Incredible historical monograph on the Great Lakes region in a period of time in which it is often ignored or glossed over. And then Kent gave it a 4 out of 5. And Kent said, a bit repetitive at times, strongly argued, and fascinating evidence. So, like I said, it's a pretty in-depth history book, but it's definitely worth your time if you're going to be doing anything in the Midwest. I found it invaluable as someone who does Midwest archaeology. I honestly don't think I would go without having read this book because it's pivotal for understanding the history of the Midwest, which obviously an archaeologist working in the Midwest should probably know something about. So that's what other people are saying about it. So I guess the last thing that we need to talk about is, should I can it or keep it? So in regards to this book, I'm definitely in the keep category. I know there probably should have been more build up there, but I'm just going to cut straight to it. It's a keep. It's in my section of my library where I can pull it quickly. Now, granted, I don't pull it off the shelf a whole heck of a lot, but the fact that the spine is there reminding me of the contents of this book, I am apt to pull it out from time to time. And actually, having looked at it over again, I'll probably go back and read 1 or 2 of the chapters just to refresh myself on some of the historical aspects of it, because I probably need a refresher every once in a while because there's just so much information being flung at me that I need a refresher. So I'm definitely going to say this is a keep. I recommend checking this book out if anything that I've talked about in this book piques your interest and you want to learn more about Frances Slocum and the Godmothers of Indiana and Michigan. But as far as last week's book, Chinatown, Ethnicity and Identity of the Chinese by Bernard Wong, 1982, I still haven't figured out how I'm going to donate that. I don't know if I'm going to donate that to a listener. We're still working out what the Patreon page is going to look like, and if that kind of can it and keep it segment, if we're going to can it and give it to someone, I might do something with it via Patreon. So stay tuned to see what I figure out and end up doing with books that I decide I'm going to purge from the library and how you might get a copy of one. So that's going to do it for this episode. Remember to follow me on the Telegram channel. It's Anthropology Archives on Telegram. And that's where I post updates about upcoming episodes, lithic illustrations for the live streams that we do on the Twitch channel, other updates about data, projects that I'm working on, possibly videos, text, sort of just a general social media thing. I'm not really big into Facebook. I mean, I don't have one. I deleted it. I don't use Twitter. I know I probably sound like a boomer right now, but I don't know. I just don't use them anymore, mostly because they've gotten so unappealing to check in and tune into. But if you want to stay up to date, I highly recommend you check out the Telegram channel because I post there regularly, probably every other day or so. And that's going to do it. And until next time, never stop reading.